My name is Lauren Garcia. I am 27 years old, and the moment I understood exactly where I stood in my family happened on a cold November evening that my mother insisted on calling our early Christmas dinner, even though it was technically Thanksgiving weekend, because she said it was easier that way, and everyone was already off work, and I drove 4 hours from my small apartment in Chicago to my parents' house in Indiana with a homemade pumpkin pie on the passenger seat and a knot in my stomach that I kept telling myself was just traffic anxiety, and not the familiar dread I had learned to ignore for most of my life. The house looked the same as it always did when I pulled into the driveway, lights blazing, cars everywhere, laughter spilling out before I even opened the door, and for a moment I let myself believe that maybe this year would be different. Maybe this time I would just blend in and survive the night without becoming the joke. So I pasted on a smile, balanced the pie in my hands, and walked inside to the sound of football on the television and overlapping conversations bouncing off the walls. The dining table was already crowded, my father Carlos sitting at the head of it with his beer. My mother Maria bustling around like the host of some perfect family commercial. My younger brother Daniel leaning back in his chair scrolling on his phone, my aunt and uncle arguing playfully about the game, everyone loud and comfortable in a way that always made me feel like a guest who had arrived without an invitation. Dinner itself passed in a blur of noise plates being passed, jokes flying back and forth. My mother correcting me twice for not helping enough even though I had barely put my coat down, and I noticed how Daniel was praised for simply showing up while I was still being subtly evaluated. But I told myself to let it go because it was the holidays and I was tired of fighting battles no one else seemed to notice. After we finished eating and the plates were cleared, my mother clapped her hands together sharply, the way she always did when she wanted attention, and announced with a bright smile that she had a little something for everyone. Since this was basically Christmas for us, and she disappeared into the living room before returning with a large gift bag stuffed with colorful packages. The room immediately shifted, people leaned forward, phones came out. My father chuckled approvingly, and one by one she began handing out gifts, starting with him, a new golf pullover that he held up proudly while everyone laughed. Then my uncle received an expensive bottle of wine that he joked about opening immediately. My aunt got a scented candle set. She loved Daniel received a gift card and a brand new jacket that my mother made a point of saying she had picked out just for him, and my cousins opened their gifts with exaggerated gratitude as the pile in the bag slowly disappeared. I sat there quietly with my hands folded in my lap, watching the bag empty, waiting for my mother to glance my way, because of course there had to be something for me too. There always was. Even if it was small, and when the last gift was handed out and the bag collapsed in on itself, and she still had not looked at me, a strange silence filled my head that was louder than the television, and I felt my face grow warm as I forced a casual smile and asked as lightly as I could if there was one for me. My mother did not hesitate. She did not even look surprised. She simply tilted her head and said in a flat voice that I should be grateful I was allowed to sit at the table, like she was reminding me of a privilege I had almost forgotten I was supposed to earn, and before I could process the words, my uncle snorted and added that I should be glad they still remembered my name, and the entire table erupted into laughter. It was not nervous laughter or awkward laughter. It was real, comfortable laughter, the kind that says everyone understands the joke and agrees on who it is about. And in that moment, something inside me went very still as I realized that this was not a misunderstanding or a slip of the tongue. This was how they saw me, the extra chair, the afterthought, the daughter who should feel lucky just to be included. I felt my throat tighten and my eyes sting, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction, so I nodded once, said good to know, and stood up to grab my coat, while the laughter slowly faded into murmurs behind me. No one stopped me. No one apologized. My mother simply shrugged and said I was being sensitive as I walked out the door, the cold air hitting my face like a slap as I stepped into the night. I got into my car, set the pumpkin pie gently on the seat beside me, and pulled out of the driveway without looking back, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached, and as the house disappeared in my rearview mirror and the road stretched dark and empty ahead of me, one thought repeated itself over and over in my head with a clarity that scared me. This was not a joke. This was a message, and I had finally heard it loud and clear. I drove for almost an hour before I realized I had not turned the radio on, the silence in the car broken only by the low hum of the highway and the steady rhythm of my tires against the pavement. And somewhere past the state line, the shock wore off enough for the memory to replay itself in sharper detail. My mother's voice calm and dismissive. My uncle's laugh the way everyone else joined in without hesitation, and I felt that familiar instinct rise up in me to explain it away, to soften it into something harmless. But for the first time, the excuses felt thin and insulting, like lies I had outgrown. The pumpkin pie sat untouched on the passenger seat. The plastic lid fogged slightly from the warmth of the car, and I thought about how carefully I had baked it the night before, how I had checked the recipe twice and packed it so it would not slide, because some part of me had still believed that showing up prepared and pleasant might buy me a smoother night, and the realization that it had meant absolutely nothing made my chest ache in a quiet, heavy way. As the miles passed and the traffic thinned, my phone buzzed once on the center console, then again lighting up the dark with my mother's name, and I let it ring without answering. My jaw clenched as I imagined what she would say, that I was dramatic, that it was a joke, that I always took things the wrong way, and I knew if I picked up I would end up apologizing for something I did not do just to make the discomfort stop. I thought about how many times I had done exactly that, swallowed my embarrassment, laughed along, paid for things, driven back home, feeling small and foolish, promising myself it would not bother me next time. And something about that pattern finally snapped as I merged onto the long stretch of road leading back toward Chicago. The night felt endless, the dashboard clock ticking forward with painful slowness. And I let myself remember moments I usually kept buried, holidays where Daniel was praised for his potential, while I was reminded to be helpful. Birthdays where my gifts were practical and his were celebrated comments about how lucky I was to have parents who tolerated my independence. And I realized with a strange calm that the dinner had not been an exception at all. It had simply been the most honest version of the truth. By the time the city lights appeared in the distance, my anger had cooled into something more focused, a tight resolve that settled deep in my stomach, and I knew that whatever happened next would not look like a screaming match or a dramatic confrontation, because I was exhausted from explaining myself to people who did not want to understand. When I finally pulled into my apartment building's garage and shut off the engine, the silence rushed back in, and I sat there for a moment with my hands resting in my lap, my reflection faint in the windshield, noticing how tired I looked and how old that tiredness felt. I carried the pie upstairs with me out of habit, set my keys on the counter, and after a moment of staring at it, I opened the trash can and dropped it in the soft thud, strangely final. Then I sank down onto the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet and let the weight of the night settle over me. I did not cry, not yet. Instead, I sat there breathing slowly, listening to the distant sounds of the city outside my window, and for the first time, I allowed myself to think. The thought I had always pushed away, that maybe the problem was not my sensitivity or my expectations. Maybe the problem was that I had been trying to earn a place at a table where I was never meant to be treated as equal, and as that realization took hold, I understood that something had shifted during that drive, something quiet but permanent, and that even though I did not know what I was going to do next, I knew without a doubt that I could not go back to pretending that night had been just another harmless family joke. I did not sleep much that night, not because I was replaying every word that had been said at the table, but because my mind kept circling a single unsettling thought, the idea that what had happened was not an isolated cruelty, but a pattern I had normalized for years. And when my alarm went off the next morning, I felt hollow rather than tired, like something had been scooped out and left room for clarity. I was not sure I was ready to face. I dragged myself through a shower, dressed for work on autopilot, and carried my coffee to the couch instead of my desk, staring at my phone as if it might offer instructions for what came next, because despite the resolve I felt on the drive home, part of me was still trained to look outward for permission. After nearly an hour of scrolling without reading anything, I finally tapped on Mia Thompson's name. My thumb hovering for a second before I hit call, and she answered on the second ring with a sleepy but familiar hello that immediately loosened the tightness in my chest. I told her everything from the beginning, The early Christmas dinner, the gifts being handed out one by one, the way my mother's voice had gone flat when I asked about mine, and the exact words she used about being grateful I could sit at the table. And as I spoke, I realized how carefully I had always edited these stories in the past, smoothing out the edges so they sounded less cruel. But this time, I did not soften anything. Mia was quiet for a long moment when I finished quiet enough that I almost apologized for dumping it on her so early in the morning, but then she said my name slowly and clearly and told me that what my family had done was not normal, not funny, and not something a loving parent says to their child, and hearing it stated so plainly made my eyes burn. She did not ask what I might have done to provoke it or suggest I talk it out for the sake of peace. Instead, she asked how long this kind of thing had been happening, and that question opened a door I had kept closed for a long time. Because once I started thinking about it, examples crowded in faster than I could organize them. I told her about the jokes at my expense, the way my brother Daniel was always praised for potential, while I was thanked for being reliable, how I was expected to contribute without being acknowledged, and how any attempt to push back was framed as me being difficult or ungrateful. And as I spoke, I felt a strange mix of embarrassment and relief, like I was finally confessing to something I had been pretending was fine. Mia listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something that landed with the weight of a verdict that my family did not respect me because they did not have to, because I had been making it easy for them not to, and the silence that followed was thick but different from before, not empty, but full. She asked me a question that startled me with its simplicity. What would happen if I stopped making it easy? And my immediate reaction was fear. Sharp and irrational images of anger and rejection flashing through my mind. But beneath that fear was a flicker of something else, a sense of possibility that felt almost dangerous. I laughed weakly and told her I could not just stop being who I was, that it would blow everything up, and she replied that maybe things needed to blow up if they were built on me shrinking myself to keep them comfortable. When we hung up, I sat there staring at my phone long after the screen went dark, her words echoing in my head, and for the first time, I considered that the discomfort I felt was not a warning to stop, but a signal that I was close to something true. I opened my laptop to start work, but found myself pulling up my banking app instead, not with a plan, just with a vague sense that if I was going to understand my place in my family, I needed to look at the evidence instead of the stories I had been telling myself. And as the familiar screen loaded and rows of transactions filled my view, I felt a slow, sinking realization take hold that whatever I was about to see would make it impossible to pretend that the dinner had been just a tasteless joke, because patterns do not reveal themselves in words alone. They reveal themselves in habits, and I was finally ready to look at mine without flinching. I stared at the banking app for a long moment before I actually scrolled my finger, hovering as if the numbers might change if I waited long enough, and when I finally moved, the list of transactions slid upward with a smoothness that felt almost mocking, revealing line after line of charges that I recognized instantly, even before my brain had time to categorize them. There was my mother's yoga studio billed monthly without fail, followed by the gym membership she insisted she needed for her health. Then a cluster of streaming services under a family plan that I barely used because I was always working late. And as I kept scrolling, I felt a pressure build behind my eyes that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with recognition. These were not unfamiliar expenses. They were old companions, the quiet background costs I had absorbed so automatically that I no longer questioned why my card was on file or how it had gotten there in the first place. I tapped into the details of one charge and saw a note I had added months ago after my mother called me in a panic saying her card was not working, and could I please just put mine on for now, she would switch it later, and I remembered how relieved she sounded when I agreed how proud I felt to be the one who could fix it without making a fuss. As I scrolled further, I saw my brother Daniel's football tickets purchased last minute with a text that said, "I will pay you back on Friday," followed by Friday coming and going without a word. And the next weekend, another charge for gas money when he borrowed my parents' car to visit friends, and my jaw tightened as I realized how rarely those promises had ever been kept. There were restaurant bills I remembered picking up because I made more money, and it was no big deal emergency repairs my uncle could not cover in the moment, ride shares ordered from my account for relatives who forgot their passwords. all of it layered together in a way that made it impossible to isolate any single instance as the problem. This was not one favor taken too far, it was a system, and I was the system. The more I scrolled, the more memories attached themselves to the numbers phone calls that started with small requests and ended with gratitude that felt warm at the time, but hollow now comments about how responsible I was, how lucky my parents were to have a daughter like me. Words that had always sounded like praise but now read like justification. I opened the date range and expanded it back another year, then another, and the list grew longer, denser, until my chest felt tight and my hands were shaking slightly. Not from anger yet, but from the slow, dawning awareness that this arrangement had not happened accidentally. I had been trained into it, shaped by years of being told to be helpful, to be grateful, to not make waves, especially as a daughter, especially compared to my brother whose needs were always framed as temporary and urgent, while mine were framed as flexible and optional. I thought back to the dinner table, to my mother's flat tone when she told me to be grateful just to sit there, and I felt a cold clarity settle over me as I understood that in her mind, my presence had value only as long as it came with usefulness attached. The realization hurt in a way that was difficult to articulate because it meant acknowledging that the affection I thought I had been earning might never have been affection at all but access. I sat back on the couch and took a deep breath, forcing myself not to close the app or minimize the screen because every instinct in me wanted to look away and soften the truth before it fully formed, but I stayed with it, scrolling carefully, deliberately, until the pattern was undeniable. This was not generosity on my part, it was expectation on theirs, and the expectation had teeth. I opened a notes document and started jotting down categories as they appeared to me. Gym and wellness, entertainment, transportation emergencies, and with each heading the list beneath it grew longer, more detailed, more difficult to dismiss as coincidence. By the time I stopped, my coffee had gone cold, and the morning light had shifted across the room, and I realized hours had passed without me noticing my work forgotten as I sat surrounded by evidence that reframed my entire role in my family. I did not feel powerful or vindicated in that moment. I felt exposed, like someone who had finally read the fine print after years of signing without question, and the most unsettling part was not the money itself, but the understanding that it had bought me nothing. I thought it had not respect, not kindness, not even basic decency at a holiday table. I closed the app slowly and set my phone down beside me, my heart beating hard but steady, and I knew that whatever I did next would change the shape of my relationships permanently. Because once you see the machinery behind the affection, you cannot unsee it, and I was no longer willing to pretend that being useful was the same as being loved. Looking at those categories triggered memories I had learned to file away as normal, and as I sat there with my laptop open and my phone face down, scenes from my childhood began lining up with an uncomfortable precision that made my stomach twist, because the numbers did not just show where my money went, they showed where I had been placed. I grew up hearing that our family valued tradition, respect, and sacrifice, words my mother Maria used often and proudly. But as a girl, I learned quickly that sacrifice had a specific direction, and it flowed from daughters to sons without much discussion. My brother Daniel, 3 years younger than me, was always described as having potential, as needing support, as being in a phase, while I was described as dependable, mature, and easy labels that sounded positive, until I realized they were excuses for why less was expected of him and more was expected of me. When Daniel forgot his homework, my mother laughed and said boys would be boys, but when I forgot a chore, I was reminded of how much stress I caused her, how tired she was, how a good daughter helped without being asked. My father, Carlos, enforced it with a quieter authority, rarely raising his voice but always backing my mother, telling me that family harmony mattered more than my feelings, and that as a woman I should learn to smooth things over rather than challenge them. Holidays followed the same script, Daniel receiving attention and indulgence. His mistakes minimized, his ambitions praised, while I was asked to help in the kitchen, to serve, to clean, to be grateful for being included at all. And over time, I internalized the message that my value came from how useful I could be rather than who I was. The first time I put my card down for something family-related, I was still in college when my mother called in a panic because a bill had been miscalculated and she needed help until the next paycheck, and I remember the pride I felt when I said yes. the warmth of being needed the way her voice softened with relief. That feeling became familiar and addictive, and before I realized it, helping had turned into paying, and paying had turned into expectation, reinforced by praise that framed my compliance as virtue. Every time I hesitated, there was a reminder of what my parents had done for me growing up: the roof, the food, the school supplies, as if those basic responsibilities were loans I was now obligated to repay with interest. When Daniel asked for money, it was framed as temporary support for his future. But when I paid, it was framed as gratitude for the past, and questioning it made me feel selfish and disloyal. Even at family gatherings, the dynamic was clear. Daniel spoke and was listened to. I spoke and was corrected, and any discomfort I showed was labeled as sensitivity, a flaw I needed to manage quietly. I could see now how the dinner table incident fit perfectly into that pattern. My mother's comment about being grateful to sit there was not spontaneous cruelty. It was a distillation of everything she had ever taught me about my place. And the laughter that followed was not accidental. It was agreement. The idea that my presence was conditional, that my seat could be revoked if I stopped performing my role, settled over me with a weight that made it hard to breathe. And for the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge how much that understanding hurt. This was not just about money or gifts, it was about being raised to believe that love was something I had to earn by shrinking, by smoothing, by paying, and that my brother's comfort mattered more than my dignity. As I sat there absorbing that truth, I felt anger rise, not the explosive kind I had always avoided, but a steady, focused anger that cut through the guilt like a blade, because I could finally see that the expectations placed on me were not moral truths. They were choices my parents had made, choices rooted in control and tradition rather than fairness. Recognizing that did not erase the years of conditioning, but it shifted something fundamental inside me, because it meant that the shame I had been carrying did not belong to me. And as painful as that realization was, it also carried a strange sense of relief. The beginning of an understanding that I did not owe my family endless compliance simply because I was born a daughter, and that if I continued to play the role they had written for me, the cost would keep rising until there was nothing left of me to give. Once I understood that the pattern was real and not something I was imagining, I knew I could not rely on memory alone, because memory was slippery and easily dismissed, especially by people who had spent years telling me I was too sensitive. So I opened my laptop and created a spreadsheet, a blank grid that felt intimidating at first, like I was about to put my own life on trial, and I titled it simply Family Expenses, telling myself that clarity required neutrality even when my hands were shaking. I started with the most obvious category, gym and wellness, and entered my mother Maria Garcia, age 55, next to the monthly yoga studio charge and the annual gym membership fee, adding dates and amounts with careful precision, and as the columns filled, I remembered the phone calls that had accompanied those payments. Her voice tight with stress, reminding me how important her health was, how much she did for everyone else, and how grateful she was that I could help just this once. From there, I moved to entertainment, listing the streaming services under my card. The family plan upgrades the movie rentals charged during weekends when I was not even home, and I felt a dull ache in my chest as I realized how often I had paid for evenings I was not invited to share. Transportation came next, a long list of ride shares, gas reimbursements that never materialized, and emergency trips that were always framed as unavoidable, followed by events and tickets, football games and concerts purchased for my brother Daniel Garcia, age 24. Each one justified as supporting his social life or helping him blow off steam after a hard week, and I could almost hear my parents' voices telling me it was different because he was still finding himself. I added a column for notes and forced myself to write down the context for each charge, the text messages, the promises to pay me back, the jokes about me being the responsible one, because I knew that without those details, it would be too easy for someone to say I was exaggerating or keeping score unfairly. As I worked, the total at the bottom of the spreadsheet climbed steadily, and with each update, I felt a mix of nausea and vindication, because the numbers did not care about intentions or guilt. They simply recorded reality, and reality was far larger and more lopsided than I had ever admitted to myself. I expanded the date range back 5 full years, telling myself that if I was going to do this, I had to do it thoroughly, and the spreadsheet grew into something dense and undeniable, a ledger of small sacrifices that had accumulated into a significant sum, one that could have changed my own life in tangible ways if it had stayed with me. I paused more than once to steady my breathing because seeing it all laid out triggered waves of conflicting emotions. Anger at my family for taking without acknowledging anger at myself, for offering without boundaries, and a deep sadness for the version of me who thought this was the price of belonging. To keep myself grounded, I color-coded the categories: blue for wellness, green for entertainment, yellow for transportation, red for emergencies, and as the colors filled the screen, it became clear that this was not a series of isolated incidents, but a system that depended on my silence to function. I thought about the dinner table again, the laughter that followed my mother's comment, and I understood now that the confidence behind that cruelty came from years of being certain I would absorb it, years of knowing that no matter how I was treated, my support would continue to flow. When I finished entering the last charge, I sat back and stared at the total, a number large enough to make my throat tighten, not because I wanted it back, but because it represented how thoroughly my generosity had been taken for granted. I did not feel the urge to march into my parents' house or confront them immediately because something in me had shifted from reaction to intention, and I knew that yelling or demanding repayment would only feed the narrative that I was unstable or vindictive. Instead, I saved the file, labeled it clearly, and backed it up, treating it with the seriousness of evidence rather than emotion. And in doing so, I felt a surprising sense of calm settle over me. This was not about winning an argument, it was about reclaiming reality. And reality once documented had a weight that words alone could not undermine. I closed my laptop and looked around my apartment, noticing details I had ignored before: the worn couch I had put off replacing the trips I had postponed, the savings goals I had delayed, because there was always another family need that took precedence. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider what it would mean to redirect that care toward myself. The thought was both liberating and frightening because it required accepting that my family might not respond with understanding or gratitude. But the alternative, continuing to subsidize my own erasure, suddenly felt far more dangerous. As I stood up and stretched my muscles stiff from hours hunched over the computer, I realized that the spreadsheet was more than a record of money. It was a map of power showing exactly where my effort had been extracted and where it had not been returned, and that knowledge gave me a sense of leverage I had never felt before. I did not yet know how I would use it, but I knew I would not be able to ignore it because once the truth is written down in black and white, pretending it is not there becomes an act of self-betrayal, and I had already spent enough of my life betraying myself for the sake of keeping the peace. I sat with the spreadsheet open on my screen for a long time after I finished it, not because I was adding anything else, but because I was letting the reality of it settle into my body, and the more I looked at it, the clearer it became that whatever came next could not involve a dramatic announcement or a long speech, because those things had never worked for me before, and only gave my family something to argue with. I knew from experience that if I tried to explain how hurt I was, my words would be picked apart, minimized, or reframed as an overreaction, and the idea of subjecting myself to that again made my stomach turn. What I wanted this time was not validation from them, it was relief for myself, and relief meant changing the system quietly instead of fighting it head on. I closed the spreadsheet, opened my banking app again, and took a deep breath, reminding myself that this was my account, my card, my responsibility, and that removing access was not an attack but a boundary. I started with the simplest change, the family streaming plan, clicking into the settings and removing my card information, the confirmation message popping up almost instantly, and I was surprised by how ordinary it felt, like canceling a subscription I no longer used. From there, I moved to my Mother Maria's gym membership, my finger hesitating for a brief moment as guilt flared, but then I remembered her voice at the dinner table and the laughter that followed, and I pressed cancel, watching the screen refresh as if nothing significant had happened. One by one, I worked through the list: yoga studio, rideshare account, online shopping services, each cancellation accompanied by a polite, automated email thanking me for my business, and with every click, I felt a subtle lightness spread through my chest. Not joy exactly, but a sense of reclaiming something that had been quietly slipping away. I did not send a message to the family group chat. I did not warn anyone, and I did not justify myself because I understood that advance notice would only invite negotiation and pressure, and I was done negotiating my own autonomy. When I finished, I sat back and waited for the panic to hit for the rush of fear that I had been conditioned to expect whenever I stepped out of line, but instead, there was a calm that felt unfamiliar and steady. That calm did not mean I thought there would be no consequences. It meant I was finally willing to face them without folding. A few hours passed, then a full day, and nothing happened. No angry calls, no frantic texts, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I had imagined how dependent they were on my support. The second day, my phone buzzed with my mother's name while I was at work, and I let it go to voicemail, listening to the message later in the privacy of my car as she complained that her gym card had been declined and asked if I had changed something by mistake, her tone irritated rather than concerned. I did not call her back right away, and that small act of restraint felt like another quiet victory proof that I could pause instead of reacting. When I finally responded, I kept my voice even and my explanation brief, telling her I had stopped paying for accounts that were not mine and that she would need to set them up herself, and the silence on the other end of the line was heavy with disbelief. She accused me of being selfish and reminded me of how much she relied on those classes, and instead of apologizing, I told her calmly that I was no longer comfortable covering expenses for people who did not treat me with respect. The call ended abruptly, and as I sat there staring at my dashboard, my heart pounding, but my hands steady, I realized that this was the first time I had ever chosen my own well-being without asking permission, and even though I knew the backlash was coming, I also knew that whatever discomfort lay ahead would be less damaging than continuing to disappear in plain sight. The silence did not last long. It never does when you remove something people have come to feel entitled to, and by the next morning, my phone was lighting up in a way that made my stomach tighten before I even looked at the screen, because I recognized the pattern immediately, the shift from confusion to irritation to accusation. My mother Maria called first, not to ask how I was or why I had made the changes, but to complain that her yoga studio had emailed her about an expired payment method and that she did not understand why her account was suddenly inactive. Her tone, sharp and offended, as if a service had been unjustly denied to her rather than a favor withdrawn. I told her plainly that I had removed my card and that she would need to update her own payment information, and there was a brief pause on the line before her voice hardened and she asked me what I thought I was doing, reminding me how important those classes were for her stress and her health, as if my responsibility extended to managing her emotional balance. I repeated myself calmly, feeling my heart race, but keeping my words measured, and said that I was no longer paying for expenses that were not mine, and the shock in her silence was almost palpable, because in that moment she realized I was not confused or apologetic. I was decided. She accused me of doing this out of spite of punishing her for a joke at dinner, and when I did not take the bait, she ended the call abruptly, leaving a ringing in my ears that felt strangely less painful than our usual conversations. Within an hour, my father Carlos called his voice controlled, but edged with irritation, telling me that the streaming services were not working and that he was getting error messages asking for updated payment information. And when I explained that I had stopped paying for those as well, he responded the way he always did when his authority was challenged by invoking family duty. He told me that family takes care of each other, that I knew better than this, and that I was making things difficult for no reason. And when I replied that respect was also part of taking care of each other, he went quiet before snapping that I was letting my city life get to my head. As the day went on, more messages trickled in my brother Daniel, texting to ask why his game tickets had been canceled and whether I could just fix it quickly because it was embarrassing an aunt asking if something was wrong, because her movie rental would not go through each message carrying the same underlying assumption that whatever had changed was temporary and that I would correct it if they complained enough. I did not respond to every message, choosing instead to step away from my phone and focus on my work. But even as I did, I could feel the tension building like a storm cloud, because every unanswered question was being interpreted not as a boundary but as a provocation. By the evening, the family group chat, which I had muted earlier, was active enough that my phone vibrated constantly despite the silence of my screen, and when I finally checked it out of curiosity, I saw a familiar chorus forming comments about how money changes people, how some people forget where they come from, how ungrateful children hurt their parents deeply, all written in vague language that never named me directly, but made the target unmistakable. I muted the chat again, my chest tight with the knowledge that the narrative was already being rewritten without me, that my decision to stop paying was being framed not as self-protection, but as betrayal. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I realized how quickly their tone had shifted from casual dependence to open hostility, and it struck me that the kindness I thought existed in our relationship had been conditional all along, dependent on my continued compliance. The speed of the backlash was both frightening and clarifying because it confirmed what I had suspected after the dinner, that my role in the family was not to be loved or respected, but to provide stability without asking for anything in return. As I went to bed with my phone face down on the nightstand, the notifications still piling up unseen, I felt a mix of dread and resolve, because while the pressure was increasing, so was my certainty that I had done the right thing, and that the anger rising on the other end of those calls was not proof of my cruelty, but proof of how deeply they had relied on me staying silent. By the third day, the irritation had curdled into something sharper and more deliberate, and it became clear that my family was no longer trying to understand what had changed, but was actively working to regain control over the story, because when people lose access, they often reach for reputation instead. I noticed it first through a text from my cousin Elena asking if everything was okay and mentioning that my mother seemed really upset online. And when I opened social media, I felt my stomach drop as I scrolled through a series of posts that were clearly about me without ever saying my name. My mother had shared a black and white quote about how ungrateful children forget the sacrifices of their parents, adding a caption about heartbreak and betrayal that framed her as a devoted mother blindsided by cruelty, and within minutes, it had accumulated supportive comments praising her strength and loyalty. My father chimed in under a different post with a line about how money comes and goes, but family is forever, and reading it felt surreal considering how quickly money had become the weapon they were using to paint me as the villain. My brother Daniel added his own contribution later that evening, posting a story about how some people choose comfort over blood and how disappointing it is to watch family turn their backs when things get hard, and the casual cruelty of it made my hands shake, as I realized he was benefiting from the very system he was defending. None of them mentioned the dinner table, the laughter, or my mother telling me to be grateful for being allowed to sit there because acknowledging that moment would collapse the narrative they were constructing, and instead they leaned heavily on implication, letting friends and extended relatives fill in the blanks with their own assumptions. Messages started trickling into my inbox from people I had not spoken to in months asking what was going on, offering unsolicited advice about forgiveness, or gently scolding me for hurting my parents, and each one landed like a small cut because it forced me to confront how easily my silence was being interpreted as guilt. I drafted replies in my head, explaining everything, imagining myself attaching screenshots and timelines. But I stopped myself because I knew that public explanations would only escalate the spectacle and invite debate from people who did not have the full context and did not need it. Instead, I did something that felt both terrifying and grounding. I said nothing, letting the posts stand without correction, trusting that the truth did not need to be litigated in comment sections. That choice did not make the situation quieter, but it shifted something inside me because for the first time, I was not scrambling to manage everyone else's feelings, and the discomfort that followed was mine to tolerate rather than mine to fix. That night, as the notifications continued to light up my phone, I sat at my kitchen table and reopened the spreadsheet, not to add new entries, but to remind myself why I had made this decision in the first place. And seeing the numbers again steadied me in a way the opinions of strangers could not. I thought about how quickly my family had moved from joking at my expense to publicly questioning my character, and I recognized the strategy for what it was, a form of gaslighting designed to isolate me and pressure me back into compliance by threatening my standing in the community. The realization hurt, but it also stripped the situation of its confusion, because once you understand that the goal is control rather than connection, the tactics lose some of their power. As I turned off my phone and went to bed, I felt the weight of what was coming settle over me because online shaming was rarely the final move. It was a warning shot, a way of testing whether I would fold under social pressure, and I knew that if I did not, they would escalate to something more direct. Lying there in the dark, listening to the distant sounds of traffic outside my window, I acknowledged the fear that tightened my chest at the thought of what they might do next. But beneath it was a steadier emotion, a quiet conviction that whatever happened, I would not hand my autonomy back just to restore a version of peace that had always required my silence. The morning after this posts went up, I woke with a dull pressure behind my eyes that felt like the aftermath of a storm, and instead of reaching for my phone out of habit, I sat on the edge of my bed and tried to decide what silence meant for me now. Because while I did not owe anyone a public explanation, I also knew that allowing my family to define the narrative unchecked would eventually be used to justify whatever escalation came next. I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and opened my laptop, the spreadsheet file already waiting on my desktop like a quiet witness. And as I stared at it, I realized that the problem was not that my family did not know what they had taken. It was that they had never been forced to look at it all at once. I drafted an email addressed to my parents, Maria Garcia, age 55, and Carlos Garcia, age 58, and included my brother Daniel Garcia, age 24, because excluding him would only allow him to continue pretending he was a bystander rather than a beneficiary, and I titled the email plainly, "Since we are talking about responsibility," giving myself a moment to breathe before I started typing. I wrote carefully, choosing words that were clear rather than emotional, acknowledging that my parents had provided for me growing up and that I was not denying the effort that went into raising me. But I also stated without apology that the idea that those years entitled anyone to unlimited financial support and tolerance in adulthood was neither healthy nor fair. I explained that I had reviewed my finances and made the decision to stop paying for expenses that were not mine, and that this decision was not made in anger but in recognition of a pattern that had become unsustainable for me. And then I attached the spreadsheet. I did not accuse them of theft or demand repayment. Instead, I pasted the total at the bottom of the email and added a short breakdown of categories: gym and wellness, entertainment, transportation events, emergencies, letting the structure speak for itself. And I ended with a single paragraph that felt like the core of everything I had been carrying, writing that if I was being labeled ungrateful and selfish for setting a boundary, then it was only fair to look at the full picture of who had been taking care of whom over the past several years. My hands were trembling slightly when I hit send, my heart pounding, as if I had just stepped into cold water, and for a few minutes afterward, I sat completely still, staring at the wall, half expecting my phone to ring immediately with accusations and outrage. The reply came quickly, but not as I expected, arriving first as a subject line in all capital letters that read, "How dare you," followed by a long block of text from my mother that turned each line of the spreadsheet into an attack on her character. She accused me of keeping score, of manipulating numbers to make her feel small, of throwing money in her face to punish her for being a mother who had sacrificed everything, and she framed my decision as an attempt to erase the love and effort she believed she had poured into raising me. My father followed with a shorter message that focused on disappointment rather than defense, telling me that family was not a transaction and that my behavior proved I had lost my values. And Daniel said nothing at all, which in some ways felt louder than anything he could have written. As I read through their responses, I felt a familiar pull to explain myself again, to clarify my intentions, to soothe the hurt feelings they were performing so convincingly. But I stopped because I recognized the pattern for what it was: an attempt to shift the conversation away from facts and back into emotion where they felt more comfortable and more powerful. Instead of replying immediately, I closed my laptop and took a walk around the block, the cold air helping to ground me as I replayed the exchange in my mind. And when I returned, I saw that my mother had already taken her response public, posting another quote about heartless children and adding a caption about being ashamed of who some people become when they prioritize money over love. Within minutes, it was met with sympathy and encouragement from friends who had no idea what was actually being discussed, and the speed with which she sought validation confirmed what I had begun to suspect, that the email was not meant to be received, it was meant to be resisted. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I felt the weight of finality settle in because by putting everything in writing and attaching proof, I had crossed an invisible line in our family, one that said I was no longer willing to participate in a version of reality that depended on my silence, and whatever came next would be shaped by that choice. I did not feel victorious or relieved. I felt braced, aware that people who are confronted with evidence rather than apologies often respond not with reflection, but with escalation, and as my phone buzzed again with notifications, I refused to check. I understood that the spreadsheet had done its job not by changing their minds, but by making it impossible for them to pretend that I was reacting to nothing. The morning after the email went out, the fallout moved faster than I expected, as if my family had been waiting for a concrete excuse to harden their position, and I learned how quickly private conflict becomes public theater when control is threatened. I found out I had been blocked on my mother's social media, not because she told me, but because Mia texted me a screenshot less than an hour after my mother's reply showing a post she had just shared about staying strong during times when children forget their roots, accompanied by comments praising her patience and devotion, none of which I could see on my own account. It was a small thing in the grand scheme, but it stung in a specific way because it made clear that the performance mattered more than the conversation, that my exclusion was not accidental, but strategic. Throughout the day, indirect messages continued to reach me through friends and extended relatives, people asking if I was really cutting my parents off over money, people gently suggesting that parents do not owe their children apologies, people advising me to be the bigger person because family unity mattered more than hurt feelings. And with each message, I felt the old reflex to explain myself tug at me again. I resisted it by returning to the facts, reminding myself that nothing about my decision was impulsive or cruel, that it was a response to years of being diminished and used, and that anyone who needed me to endure that quietly in order to feel comfortable was not actually concerned with my well-being. That afternoon, I muted several conversations and blocked a few numbers, not out of spite, but out of necessity, because the constant drip of opinion was draining my energy and pulling me back into a role I was trying to leave behind. When I came home from work that evening, my apartment felt unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a confrontation you know is not finished, and I found myself double-checking that my door was locked. An anxious habit I had not had before but could not seem to shake. I sat on the couch with my laptop open, rereading my email to make sure I had not said anything. I regretted, and as I did, I realized that the most telling response from my family had been what they did not address at all. Not one of them had denied the accuracy of the spreadsheet. Not one of them had acknowledged the imbalance it revealed, and that silence spoke volumes because it meant the argument was never about whether I was right. It was about whether I was allowed to say it. That realization brought a sharp clarity with it because it confirmed that the discomfort I was experiencing now was not the result of wrongdoing on my part, but the predictable backlash that follows boundary setting in families where boundaries have never existed. As night settled in, my phone buzzed again, this time with a voicemail from my aunt asking me to reconsider for the sake of my parents' health. And while the guilt that message was designed to provoke was familiar, it no longer landed the way it once did, because I could hear the manipulation beneath the concern. I deleted the voicemail without responding and sat there for a moment, listening to the steady hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of traffic outside, grounding myself in the physical reality of my own space. For the first time since the dinner, I felt a fragile sense of control returning, not because things were calm, but because I was no longer chasing calm at my own expense. That night, as I prepared for bed, I noticed a tightness in my shoulders that I had carried for years begin to ease slightly, and I understood that while the situation with my family was far from resolved, I had taken a step that could not be undone. I had put the truth in writing. I had refused to retreat into silence, and I had accepted that their reaction was not something I could manage or fix. And as I turned off the lights and lay down, I had no way of knowing that the next escalation would not come through a screen or a message, but through the very door of my home, forcing the conflict out of the realm of words and into something far more immediate and impossible to ignore. 2 weeks after that dinner on a quiet Saturday afternoon, when I was finally starting to feel like the worst of the storm might have passed, the buzzer to my apartment went off sharp and insistent, cutting through the low noise of a video playing in the background, and my first thought was that it had to be a delivery because I had not invited anyone over and I had deliberately kept my plans small and contained. When I checked my phone a second later and saw my father Carlos calling, my stomach dropped with a certainty that felt almost physical, because I knew before I answered that whatever calm I had managed to build was about to be tested. I let the call ring out and stood up slowly, walking toward the intercom with a tightness in my chest that made each step feel heavier than the last. And when I pressed the button just enough to hear the lobby, my mother, Maria's voice floated up through the speaker, overly bright and performative, calling my name like she was greeting me at a holiday party instead of standing uninvited in my building. She said they were downstairs and that they had brought me something, and there was a false cheer in her tone that made my skin prickle because I recognized it as the voice she used when she wanted an audience. I did not buzz them in, and I did not respond right away, choosing instead to look through the peephole toward the hallway, my heart racing as I listened to the muted sounds of movement outside my door. A few minutes later, there was a knock light at first, followed by another, and when I looked again, I saw my parents standing there with two shiny gift bags, red and green tissue paper spilling out, my mother holding them up slightly as if they were proof of good intentions rather than props. She knocked again and called out softly, telling me they just wanted to talk and that they had driven a long way to see me, and for a split second, the old reflex flared the urge to open the door and smooth things over so the tension would stop. I took a breath and reminded myself that they had not asked if they could come, they had decided, and that decision alone told me everything I needed to know. I spoke through the closed door, my voice steadier than I felt, and told them I was not available to talk and that they needed to leave, and the shift in my mother's tone was immediate, the sweetness draining away as she knocked harder and said they had come all this way and I owed them a conversation. My father joined in, his voice low and irritated, saying it was ridiculous to handle family matters through a door, and that I needed to act like an adult, and the entitlement in his words made my hands tremble as I clenched them at my sides. I told them again that I did not want to talk and that showing up without asking was not acceptable, and there was a brief pause before my mother leaned into the performance, raising her voice just enough to carry down the hallway as she said they had brought me Christmas gifts and that they were trying to make things right. The implication hung in the air, clear and manipulative, that if I did not open the door, I would look unreasonable to anyone listening, and I realized in that moment that the bags were not for me at all. They were for the story they wanted to tell afterward. I felt a surge of anger, then sharp and grounding, because they had not apologized for the dinner, they had not acknowledged the email or the spreadsheet, and they were trying to bypass accountability with objects and guilt. I told them plainly that gifts did not fix what had been said and done, that I needed space and that they had to leave, and my mother snapped that I was being cruel, and that this was what my city life had done to me, turning me against my own family. My father said I was humiliating them by refusing to open the door and that neighbors could hear, and when I did not respond, the knocking turned louder, more forceful, echoing down the hall in a way that made my pulse spike. I stood there staring at the door, my keys clenched in my hand, repeating silently that I was allowed to say no, that I did not have to open it just because they demanded it, and after several minutes of knocking, pleading, and raised voices, they finally stepped back. I heard my mother sniff loudly and complain that I was breaking her heart, my father muttering under his breath about disrespect. And then the sounds receded as they walked toward the elevator, leaving behind a thick silence that made my ears ring. I slid down onto the floor with my back against the door once they were gone, my legs shaking as the adrenaline drained out of me, and I realized that something fundamental had shifted because this was no longer a disagreement happening at a distance. They had brought the conflict to my home, crossed a line without hesitation, and proven that when words and guilt did not work, they were willing to escalate physically, and as I sat there catching my breath, I understood with a clarity that scared me that this visit was not a reconciliation attempt, it was a warning, and that next time they came, they would not be carrying gift bags. I barely slept that night, every small sound in my apartment pulling me half awake, and by morning the adrenaline from the visit had settled into a tight, buzzing vigilance that followed me through my routine like a shadow. Because once someone shows you they are willing to cross your physical boundaries, you cannot unknow that truth. I went to work and forced myself to focus answering emails and sitting through meetings with a practiced calm, but underneath it all, my body stayed tense, bracing for the next impact, and that instinct proved justified sooner than I expected. By early afternoon, my phone started vibrating again, first with missed calls from my mother Maria, then my father Carlos, then numbers I did not recognize. And when I finally checked my voicemail during a break, I heard my mother's voice layered thick with emotion, talking about how humiliated she felt, how I had slammed the door in her face, how the drive back had been agonizing, and how I was tearing the family apart over nothing. She said she did not raise me to treat my parents like strangers, that everything they had ever done was out of love, and that my refusal to open the door proved I had lost my sense of right and wrong. My father's message followed colder and more controlled, telling me that we were not finished talking and that avoiding them would only make things worse, his tone carrying the implicit threat that he would decide when the conversation was over, not me. As the messages piled up, so did the pressure, each one pushing the same idea that my boundary was not legitimate, that my no was a temporary obstacle to be worn down, rather than a final answer to be respected. I did not respond, and that silence seemed to act like fuel rather than a deterrent because within an hour, my brother Daniel texted me saying our parents were worried sick and that I needed to stop being dramatic and just talk to them, framing their behavior as concern and mine as cruelty. When I replied that showing up uninvited and pounding on my door was not concern, it was harassment, his response was immediate and dismissive, telling me I was exaggerating and that no one had touched me, as if minimizing the experience would erase it. The gaslighting was so familiar, it almost felt scripted, the insistence that my perception was flawed and that the problem was my reaction rather than their actions, and recognizing that pattern in real time made my hands shake with a mix of anger and clarity. Later that evening, the tone shifted again, this time into something sharper and more openly coercive when my father called and left a message telling me that if I kept this up, I would regret it, that family issues should stay within the family, and that I did not want outsiders involved. The implication was clear enough to make my stomach drop, because it revealed how much they believed they were entitled to control the situation on their terms, and how threatened they felt by the idea of anyone else witnessing their behavior. I sat on my couch listening to that message twice, my heart pounding, and realized that the fear I felt was not imaginary or overblown. It was my body recognizing a real escalation from emotional pressure into intimidation. I opened my laptop and started typing out everything that had happened since the dinner dates, times, exact phrases I remembered, not because I planned to send it to anyone yet, but because I needed to anchor myself in facts before the narrative was twisted further. Writing it all down had a grounding effect, each sentence pulling the experience out of the fog of emotion and into something concrete, and by the time I finished, the pattern was undeniable. Humiliation, followed by withdrawal of resources, followed by guilt, followed by public shaming, followed by physical intimidation. Seeing it laid out like that made it impossible to pretend this was just family conflict because healthy families do not respond to boundaries with threats. As I saved the document and closed my laptop, I felt a heavy sadness settle in alongside the resolve because acknowledging the seriousness of the situation meant accepting that the people who were supposed to protect me were now the source of my fear. That night, as I checked the locks on my door and set my phone face down on the table, I understood that my parents were not trying to reconcile. They were trying to reassert control, and that each time I refused to give it back, the tactics would likely grow more aggressive. The realization was sobering and frightening, but it also stripped away the last of my doubt. Because if setting a boundary provoked this level of reaction, then the boundary was not only justified, it was necessary, and whatever came next would require me to treat this situation not as a disagreement to be smoothed over, but as a line that had already been crossed. The next escalation came quietly, at first disguised as concern, which somehow made it more unsettling than the shouting because it meant they were adapting instead of backing down. 2 days after the visit, my building manager emailed me asking if everything was all right, explaining that there had been complaints about raised voices in the hallway over the weekend and that security had been alerted by another tenant who felt uncomfortable. Reading that message sent a chill through me, not because I was surprised, but because it confirmed that my parents had not only crossed a boundary, they had done it loudly enough that strangers had noticed. I replied with a brief thank you and said the situation had been handled, keeping my explanation minimal while asking what steps I should take if it happened again, and the manager responded that security could be called immediately and that repeated incidents might require formal documentation. The phrase formal documentation stayed with me all day, echoing in my mind as I went through my work tasks on autopilot because it represented a shift from family drama into something with real consequences. That evening, my mother Maria called again, her voice softer than it had been in days, telling me she was worried about me and that neighbors talking was embarrassing for everyone, as if the problem were perception rather than behavior. She suggested we meet somewhere neutral to talk things through, framing it as a compromise, and for a moment I felt the old pull to agree, just to make the tension stop. I paused before responding, aware of how carefully she had chosen her tone, and told her that I was not interested in meeting until the yelling and surprise visits stopped, and that any future conversation would need to respect my boundaries. Her sigh was heavy and theatrical, and she told me I was being unreasonable and dramatic, that families fight sometimes, and that I was turning a simple disagreement into a crisis. When I did not budge, her patience evaporated, and she snapped that if I kept refusing to talk like an adult, I would force her to take other steps, leaving the sentence hanging just long enough to feel like a threat. I hung up with my hands shaking, my heart racing as I replayed her words, because the implication was unmistakable that she believed she had leverage beyond guilt and public opinion. Within an hour, my aunt called to say my mother was beside herself and that I needed to be careful because my parents were talking about how worried they were about my mental state and how my behavior was not like me. The warning was subtle but chilling because it suggested a narrative forming that cast me as unstable rather than autonomous, and the weight of that realization settled in my chest like a stone. I thanked my aunt for letting me know and ended the call, sitting there in silence as the pieces clicked into place, because once someone starts questioning your sanity as a response to boundaries, the situation has moved into dangerous territory. I opened the document I had started and added the new developments, noting exact phrases and times, my fingers steady despite the knot in my stomach, because writing it down made it harder for the fear to distort my memory. As I typed, I thought about how easily concern can be weaponized, how quickly care can turn into control when someone believes they have the right to decide what is best for you. That night, I slept with my phone on the nightstand and my keys within reach, the apartment feeling smaller and more vulnerable than it ever had before, and I woke up to 3 missed calls from my father Carlos and a voicemail that made my chest tighten as soon as I heard his voice. He said they were worried about me, that my behavior was erratic, and that if I did not sit down and talk to them soon, they would have to consider getting help involved because they loved me too much to watch me spiral. There it was, the unspoken threat made explicit enough to hear, and as the message ended, I felt a rush of cold clarity wash over me because I understood exactly what he was doing. He was reframing my refusal to comply as a sign of instability, laying the groundwork to justify further intrusion, and the thought of that narrative taking hold filled me with a fear that was sharper than anything I had felt before. I did not respond right away, choosing instead to sit at my kitchen table and breathe until the shaking in my hands eased, reminding myself that being firm did not make me unwell, and that protecting myself did not mean I was broken. As the sun rose higher and the city noise filtered in through my windows, I accepted a truth I had been circling for days, that my parents were no longer just pushing my boundaries. They were testing how far they could go without consequences, and that if I wanted this to stop, I would need to stop treating it like a family disagreement and start treating it like what it was, becoming a pattern of harassment that required more than patience to confront. The decision to involve anyone outside the family did not come from anger. It came from fear, settling into my bones in a way I could no longer ignore, because once my parents began suggesting that my refusal to submit was evidence of instability, I understood that silence was no longer neutral, it was risky. I spent that morning moving through my apartment with a heightened awareness, double-checking the locks, glancing at the hallway through the peephole whenever a sound echoed outside my body, reacting as if it were bracing for impact even when nothing happened. I sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop and opened the document again, reading through the timeline I had built, and this time I did not skim it. I read every line, slowly letting myself see the progression clearly from humiliation to retaliation to intimidation. Seeing it laid out like that stripped away the lingering hope that this was a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with one more conversation, because healthy people do not escalate this way when they are told no. I picked up my phone and called the building's security office, my voice steady but tight as I explained that my parents had shown up uninvited, that they had refused to leave when asked, and that the situation felt like it was escalating. The guard listened carefully, asked clarifying questions, and told me that if they returned, I should call immediately and that the incident would be documented, his calm professionalism grounding me in a way my family never had. After hanging up, I emailed the building manager again, thanking them for reaching out earlier and asking how to formally document the incident in case of future visits, and when the reply came confirming that reports could be filed and shared with law enforcement if necessary, I felt a mix of dread and relief settle in my chest. This was not the direction I had ever imagined things going, but pretending it was not necessary would not protect me. That afternoon, as if on cue, my phone buzzed with a message from my father Carlos telling me they needed to talk immediately and that avoiding them was only making things worse, and instead of responding emotionally, I replied with a single sentence stating that any further unannounced visits would be considered harassment and that communication would need to stop for now. The message was brief, factual, and terrifying to send because it made explicit what I had been trying to imply, and the response was immediate and furious. He accused me of threatening them, of treating them like criminals, of overreacting, and then warned me again not to involve outsiders, as if the very act of seeking help was a betrayal in itself. I did not engage further, and within minutes, my mother Maria followed with a long message oscillating between sobbing pleas and sharp accusations telling me she could not sleep, that her blood pressure was high, that doctors said stress was dangerous for her, and asking how I could live with myself if something happened to her. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening as the old guilt reflex flared, but this time I recognized it for what it was. An attempt to make me responsible for consequences that were not mine to carry. I put my phone face down and forced myself to sit with the discomfort instead of rushing to soothe it, reminding myself that adults are responsible for managing their own health and emotions. That evening, when I stepped out to throw away the trash, I felt my pulse spike at the sight of a familiar car parked down the block, and even though it drove away before I could be sure, the fear it triggered lingered long after, making my hands shake as I locked my door behind me. I realized then that I was living in a state of constant vigilance, scanning for threats in places that had once felt safe, and that no amount of internal resolve would make that feeling go away without external boundaries to back it up. I sat down on my couch and called Mia, my voice breaking as I told her everything that had happened since the dinner, and she listened quietly before saying something that cut through the fog of doubt, which was that love does not make you feel afraid in your own home. Hearing it said so plainly unlocked a dam of emotion I had been holding back, and as I cried, I felt the weight of what I was accepting, that protecting myself might permanently alter my relationship with my family, and that this was a price I might have to pay for safety. When the call ended, I wiped my face, opened my laptop again, and saved copies of every message, voicemail, and email in a folder labeled by date. My actions methodical and deliberate, because I knew now that clarity and documentation were my strongest allies. As I shut the computer and looked around my apartment, the place I had worked so hard to make my own, I felt a resolve settle in that was quieter than anger, but far stronger, because I understood that whatever came next, I was done pretending that this was normal, and I was prepared to take the next step if they forced my hand. The next time they came, there was no warning at all. No call, no text, no attempt to soften the arrival with excuses or gifts, and that was how I knew something had shifted from pressure into confrontation. I was coming home from work just as the sun was setting, my arms full of groceries, my mind occupied with nothing more dramatic than what I would cook for dinner when I turned the corner onto my floor and saw them standing there like they belonged. My mother Maria, my father Carlos, and my uncle Rafael positioned in front of my door in a way that blocked the hallway. My stomach dropped so fast it made me dizzy because the sight alone confirmed every fear I had been trying to manage, that they were no longer asking, they were asserting. My mother spoke first loud enough for anyone nearby to hear, asking if I felt proud of myself for calling security on my own parents, framing herself as wounded and me as cruel before I could even set my bags down. I told them calmly that they were not supposed to be there and that they needed to leave my voice steady despite the shaking in my hands, and my father stepped closer, his expression hard, telling me that we were going to talk now whether I liked it or not. The hallway suddenly felt very small, the walls pressing in as my uncle leaned against the wall with a faint smirk, commenting that I was being dramatic and that family did not need permission to see each other, his words carrying the same dismissive tone he had used my entire life. I repeated myself louder this time, telling them to leave, and my mother scoffed, saying I was twisting things and acting like a victim, that no one was hurting me, that I was just trying to punish them. My father said this had gone far enough, and that I was coming home with them for Christmas, that this nonsense would stop. And the way he said it as a decision rather than a suggestion sent a rush of fear through my chest. I felt my back brush against my own door as he stepped closer, and when my uncle reached out and put his hand on my arm, not violently, but firmly enough to steer me away from the lock, something in me went very still. I shook his hand off and said clearly, "Do not touch me again," my voice echoing down the hallway, and for a moment there was silence, thick and charged. My mother snapped that I was making a scene, accusing me of trying to make them look abusive, and my father muttered that I was out of control, that this was exactly what he had been talking about. I pulled my phone out of my pocket with hands that felt both numb and electric and called building security, stating my address and saying that my family was there again, that they had been told to leave before, and that one of them had put his hands on me. Saying it out loud made my heart pound, but it also anchored me in reality because once the words were spoken, they could not be taken back or reframed. My uncle laughed under his breath, calling it ridiculous, while my mother's voice rose into a wail about how I was destroying the family, how I wanted them arrested, how I would regret this, and my father told me to hang up and stop embarrassing them. I did not hang up. A neighbor's door cracked open down the hall, then another, and I caught the eye of an older woman who had stepped out with her phone already raised, recording her gaze steady and unapologetic. She looked at me and gave a small nod, and that gesture alone made my knees weak with relief because it meant I was no longer alone in this moment. When the security guard arrived, he took in the scene quickly, listened to me explain that this was the second unannounced visit and that I had asked them to leave multiple times, and then turned to my parents and uncle telling them they needed to leave the property immediately. My mother protested, crying about concerned parents and misunderstanding. My father argued that he had a right to talk to his daughter, and my uncle scoffed that this was all blown out of proportion, but the guard was unmoved. He stated plainly that I lived there, that I had withdrawn consent, and that further visits would be considered trespassing. As they were escorted toward the elevator, my mother clutched her chest dramatically, saying she felt dizzy, that the stress was too much, and my father snapped that this was on me, that I had done this to her. I stood there shaking my groceries abandoned on the floor, watching them leave, and for the first time, the fear was matched by something else. A hard clarity, because whatever story they told themselves or others after this, there were now witnesses' reports and a record that did not depend on my silence. When the hallway finally emptied and the doors closed, I leaned against my own door and slid down until I was sitting on the floor, my heart racing, my hands trembling, but my resolve intact because the line they had crossed was now undeniable and the consequences were no longer hypothetical. After the elevator doors closed behind them, the silence in the hallway felt unreal, like the air itself was holding its breath, and I stayed on the floor longer than I needed to, my back pressed to my door, forcing myself to slow my breathing while my hands shook uncontrollably. The security guard asked if I was all right and if I needed anything else, and I managed to thank him and say no, my voice thin but steady enough to get the words out, because the truth was that what I needed most in that moment was to be alone in my own space without anyone demanding access to me. Once he left, I gathered my groceries with clumsy hands, unlocked my door, and stepped inside, locking it behind me with a click that felt louder than it ever had before. I leaned against the counter and closed my eyes, the adrenaline still surging through my body, and it hit me all at once that this was no longer something I could minimize or rationalize away. This was not a misunderstanding or a family argument that got out of hand. This was a pattern that had moved from emotional pressure into physical intimidation, and the realization settled in my chest with a heaviness that made me feel both older and strangely clearer. I checked my phone and saw several new messages, all sent within minutes of the confrontation, my mother accusing me of cruelty, my father warning me that I had gone too far, my uncle sending a short text telling me I would regret embarrassing him, and instead of responding, I saved each one, taking screenshots and labeling them with the date and time, my movements precise and methodical, as if I were following instructions I had been given somewhere deep inside. That night I barely slept, replaying the scene over and over in my mind, the way my father had stepped closer, the casual entitlement in my uncle's touch, the certainty in my mother's voice that she could still bend me if she pushed hard enough. Each replay reinforced the same truth, that if I had opened that door, if I had tried to talk it out the way they demanded, I would have been walking back into a dynamic where my discomfort did not matter. The next morning, I called the building manager and asked for a copy of the incident report, my voice steadier than I felt, and when it arrived in my inbox later that day, seeing the events described in neutral language by someone outside my family made my chest tighten with a mix of grief and validation. It listed raised voices, refusal to leave unwanted physical contact, and security intervention, and reading those words felt like looking at my life from a distance, stripped of excuses and emotional fog. I forwarded the report to myself, saved it in the same folder as the messages and emails, and then I sat there staring at my laptop, realizing that this documentation was not about revenge or punishment. It was about safety. In the afternoon, my phone rang again, my mother's name lighting up the screen, and for the first time, I did not feel torn about whether to answer. I let it go to voicemail and listened later as she cried about humiliation and heartbreak, about how neighbors must think terrible things about them now, and how this was not how families behaved, never once acknowledging the fear she had caused or the boundaries she had crossed. When the message ended, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me because her words confirmed what I already knew, that her focus was still on image and control, not on repair. I spent the rest of the day doing practical things, emailing my workplace to let them know I might need flexibility, making a list of emergency contacts, and calling Mia again to tell her what had happened, her sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line echoing my own reaction from earlier. She told me plainly that I had done the right thing, that involving security was not an overreaction but a necessary response, and hearing that from someone who had no stake in controlling me felt like a lifeline. As evening fell, I sat on my couch with the lights low, listening to the familiar sounds of my apartment, and for the first time since the dinner, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened. I grieved not just the loss of peace, but the loss of the illusion that my family would ever choose respect over dominance without being forced to. That grief was sharp, but it was also clarifying because it freed me from the hope that had kept me trapped for so long. I understood then that whatever came next would not be about convincing them to see me differently. It would be about protecting the life I was building, even if that meant accepting a distance I had once feared more than anything. The next step did not feel dramatic or empowering in the way people like to imagine moments of justice. It felt procedural, heavy, and necessary, the kind of decision you make when you accept that hoping someone will change is no longer a safety plan. The morning after I received the incident report, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and my phone beside it, staring at the number for the local non-emergency police line that the building manager had included in her email, my finger hovering over the screen longer than I wanted to admit. Calling felt like crossing a psychological threshold because it meant acknowledging that my parents and uncle were no longer just people who hurt me emotionally. They were people whose behavior now met a legal definition, and that realization carried a grief I had not fully processed yet. When I finally pressed call, my voice shook slightly as I explained the situation to the officer, giving dates describing the repeated unannounced visits, the refusal to leave the unwanted physical contact, and the security intervention. And as I spoke, I was careful to stick to facts rather than emotion, anchoring myself in the timeline I had already documented. The officer listened, asked calm, clarifying questions. and told me that what I was describing qualified as harassment and that I had grounds to file a report and pursue a restraining order if the behavior continued his tone, professional and unreactive, in a way that made my chest loosen for the first time in days. After the call ended, I sat there in silence, letting the weight of that information settle, because hearing it framed that way stripped away the last lingering doubt that I was overreacting or misinterpreting things. This was not about hurt feelings, it was about safety. Later that afternoon, I went down to the building office and signed the paperwork, formally documenting the incident, my name and address printed cleanly at the top of the page, and as I handed it back to the manager, she looked at me kindly and said she was glad I had taken steps to protect myself. That simple statement almost broke me because it was the first time an authority figure had framed my actions as protection rather than rebellion. When I returned to my apartment, I found another voicemail waiting, this one from my father, Carlos. His voice tight with anger as he told me I had humiliated the family, that involving security and police was unforgivable, and that I was making enemies I did not need. He warned me again that this would have consequences, that people would talk that I was burning bridges I might need one day, and as I listened, I noticed something shift inside me because instead of fear, his words now triggered a clear understanding of motive. He was not worried about my safety or even about reconciliation. He was worried about losing control of the narrative and facing accountability outside the family system. I did not respond. Instead, I forwarded the voicemail to myself and added it to the folder, my actions steady and deliberate, because I knew now that every attempt to intimidate me was also evidence. That evening, I called my workplace again and explained that I might need to leave early or work remotely if the situation escalated, and my manager responded with more understanding than I had expected, reminding me that my safety came first and that accommodations could be made. Hearing that lifted a weight I had not realized I was carrying, because it reminded me that support did not have to be begged for, it could be offered without strings attached. As night fell, I sat on my couch with a blanket wrapped around me, replaying the events of the past weeks, not with self-blame, but with a growing sense of coherence, seeing how each step had led logically to the next. The dinner had revealed the contempt the cancellations had exposed, the entitlement the online posts had shown. The manipulation and the visits had proven the willingness to intimidate when softer tactics failed. There was a strange peace in that clarity, even as it came with loss, because it meant I could stop questioning my own judgment. Before going to bed, I typed a short message to my parents and brother, not as an invitation to argue, but as a boundary put in writing, stating that further unannounced visits or attempts to contact me would be considered harassment and handled through proper channels, and that I would not engage in further discussion at this time. My finger trembled slightly as I hit send, not because I doubted the words, but because I knew they marked a turning point that could not be undone. When I turned off the lights and lay down, my body still tense, but my mind clearer than it had been in weeks, I understood that the justice unfolding here was not loud or satisfying in a cinematic way. It was quiet, incremental, and rooted in systems that did not care about family hierarchies or guilt. It was the kind of justice that begins when you stop asking permission to be safe, and for the first time since that Thanksgiving dinner, I allowed myself to believe that safety was something I was allowed to choose. The silence that followed my message was immediate and unsettling, the kind that feels less like peace and more like a held breath, and for several days my phone stayed quiet in a way that made me wary rather than relieved, because I had learned that absence could be a tactic just as easily as presence. I went to work, kept my routines, and tried to settle back into a sense of normalcy. But I noticed how often my attention drifted to the hallway outside my apartment, how every unexpected sound made my shoulders tense, my body still calibrated to anticipate intrusion. Friends asked how I was doing, and I gave measured answers, not because I wanted to minimize what had happened, but because explaining it in full required an emotional energy I was still rebuilding, and I needed to conserve what little I had. A week passed without contact, then another, and in that space, something unexpected happened. My thoughts stopped orbiting around my family and began to widen, filling with ordinary concerns. Again, grocery lists, work, deadlines, weekend plans, the small decisions that make up a life when it is not constantly being interrupted. I realized how much mental real estate my family had occupied for years, how even in moments of quiet, I had been anticipating their needs or bracing for their judgments, and noticing that absence felt both liberating and sad. The sadness surprised me not because I missed the way they treated me, but because I was mourning the family I had been taught to believe I had, the one where love and respect were not conditional on compliance. That grief came in waves, sometimes triggered by small things. A commercial about holidays, a coworker talking about visiting their parents, and when it did, I let myself feel it without rushing to fix or suppress it, understanding that grieving a fantasy is still grieving. The first real test of my resolve came on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday evening when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and as soon as I opened it, my stomach dropped because the message was unmistakably from my uncle Raphael. He wrote that he wanted to clear the air, that things had gotten out of hand, and that it would be better to talk privately, rather than involve people who did not understand family dynamics. His phrasing careful and almost reasonable. I did not reply, and within minutes another message came through, sharper this time, accusing me of hiding behind rules and outsiders, and warning that I was making a mistake that would follow me for the rest of my life. Instead of engaging, I forwarded the messages to myself, added them to the folder, and blocked the number, my hands steady as I did it because I recognized the familiar pattern, the shift from conciliatory to threatening when access was denied. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because the situation was resolved, but because I had trusted myself enough to act in alignment with my own safety rather than reacting to fear. A few days later, a letter arrived in the mail, my parents' handwriting unmistakable, even before I opened it, and for a moment, I considered throwing it away, unopened, but I decided to read it, knowing that whatever it contained would not change my boundaries. The letter was a strange blend of apology and justification, acknowledging that things had gone too far, while insisting that their intentions had always been loving, and ending with a request to meet in person, to put everything behind us before the holidays. There was no mention of accountability, no acknowledgement of intimidation or unwanted contact, only a desire to reset without addressing what had actually happened. And as I folded the letter and set it aside, I felt a quiet certainty settle in because I finally understood that reconciliation without responsibility was just another form of control. I did not respond. Instead, I added the letter to my folder and went about my evening cooking dinner, calling a friend, and watching a movie without checking my phone every few minutes, small acts that felt like reclaiming pieces of myself. Over time, the attempts to reach me became less frequent, the messages fewer and farther between, and while I knew that did not guarantee they would not resurface, it did signal that my refusal to engage was having an effect. I started therapy during that period, sitting across from someone who listened without judgment as I laid out the history of my family dynamics, and when she described what I had experienced as a combination of emotional abuse and enmeshment, the words landed with a weight that was both validating and painful. Naming it did not erase it, but it gave me a framework that was not rooted in shame, and that shift changed the way I spoke to myself. Softer, more patient, less inclined to question my own reality. As weeks turned into months, I noticed how my nervous system slowly recalibrated, how my body began to relax in my own home, how laughter came more easily, how decisions felt less fraught when they were not filtered through the question of how my family would react. The justice in all of this was not dramatic or public. It was subtle and sustained unfolding in the form of distance documentation and the quiet reinforcement of boundaries that held even when challenged. I knew that my family might tell a different story about what happened, casting themselves as victims and me as ungrateful, but for the first time that story no longer defined me because I had learned that peace does not require consensus, only consistency. As winter settled in and the holidays passed quietly, I began to notice changes that were less dramatic but more meaningful than any confrontation, because without the constant pressure from my family, my life started to expand in small, almost invisible ways. I slept through the night without jolting awake to phantom knocks or buzzing phones, and when I came home from work, my apartment felt like a refuge instead of a place I had to defend. I stopped scanning social media for indirect attacks and realized one afternoon that I had gone an entire day without thinking about what my parents or brother might be saying about me, and that realization brought a wave of relief so strong it made me laugh out loud in my empty kitchen. Therapy became a steady anchor during that time, a space where I could unpack not just the recent events, but the years that led up to them, the jokes at my expense, the expectation that I would absorb discomfort, so others could remain comfortable the way my value in the family had always been tied to what I provided, rather than who I was. Naming those patterns out loud was painful, but it also gave me language for boundaries I had never been taught were allowed. Outside that room, I practiced those boundaries in everyday ways, saying no without explanations, declining invitations that felt draining, and choosing rest without justifying it. And each time I did, the world did not collapse the way I had been warned it would. The practical consequences of my decision became clearer through secondhand updates, not because I sought them out, but because they inevitably filtered back through relatives and acquaintances. My mother had to scale back some of her activities once the extra expenses were no longer quietly covered. My father complained about having to handle subscriptions and bills himself, and my brother picked up extra shifts to pay for things he had once assumed would be taken care of. And hearing these things stirred a complicated mix of emotions. There was a part of me that felt guilty, conditioned as I was to equate support with love, but there was also a growing understanding that adults adapting to reality was not a tragedy. It was simply what happens when dependence is removed. What struck me most was how quickly their narrative shifted once the crisis energy faded, how the dramatic posts slowed, how the accusations softened into vague comments about misunderstandings and tough times, as if they were trying to ease themselves out of a story that had not ended the way they expected. I did not correct them or confront them about it because by then I understood that my silence was not agreement, it was disengagement, and that difference mattered. Around that same time, I reconnected with parts of myself that had been dormant for years, signing up for a class I had always wanted to take, spending weekends with friends who knew how to listen without fixing and planning a small trip without worrying about how my absence would be perceived. These choices were not grand gestures of independence, but they felt revolutionary to me because they were made without fear of backlash. One evening, as I was cleaning out a drawer, I found an old card from my mother written years earlier, full of affectionate language and promises of unconditional love, and instead of feeling confused or hurt by the contrast, I felt a calm clarity because I could hold two truths at once. She had loved me in the ways she was capable of, and those ways were still not enough to justify control, humiliation, or fear. Accepting that complexity did not excuse the harm, but it allowed me to stop searching for a version of events that would make everything make sense. The legal aspect of what had happened remained quietly present in the background, the incident report filed, the documentation saved the knowledge that if boundaries were crossed again, I would not hesitate to act, and that awareness itself functioned as a kind of shield. Nothing further came of it, and while part of me remained vigilant, another part relaxed into the reality that consistency had done what arguments never could. As spring approached, my parents sent a brief message wishing me well, cautious and formal, and I responded politely without reopening the door to negotiation, keeping the exchange contained and neutral. That interaction brief, as it was confirmed that distance did not have to be dramatic to be effective, it just had to be maintained. Looking back on the months since that Thanksgiving dinner, I could see how the most profound change was not in my family, but in me, in the way I no longer measured my worth by my usefulness or mistook anxiety for obligation. I understood now that justice does not always arrive as a verdict or an apology. Sometimes it shows up as the quiet ability to live without fear in your own home, to make choices without anticipating punishment, and to let other adults face the consequences of their own behavior. The story my family tells about me may never align with my own, but I have learned that alignment is not a requirement for peace, and as I stood at my window one evening watching the city lights come on, I felt something that had eluded me for a long time, a grounded sense that my life belonged to me, and that was more than enough. By the time summer arrived, the distance between my family and me had settled into something steady and unsurprising, not because the past had been resolved, but because I had stopped trying to resolve it for everyone. My days took on a rhythm that felt earned rather than borrowed, mornings that began without dread, evenings that ended without rehearsing explanations in my head, and weekends that belonged to me instead of being held in reserve for emergencies that were never really emergencies. The quiet changes were the ones that mattered most, the way my shoulders no longer crept toward my ears when my phone buzzed, the way my breath stayed, even when I passed my building's front desk, the way my apartment finally felt like a place I lived instead of a place I defended. I noticed that my thoughts had shifted too. No longer looping through old conversations, looking for better responses, no longer scanning my memory for moments I could use to justify my choices, because justification had stopped being the currency of my life. When relatives reached out with updates or questions, I answered politely and briefly, declining to be pulled into commentary or debate. And each time I did, the interaction ended sooner and with less drama, as if the lack of fuel had finally begun to starve the fire. One afternoon, a coworker invited me to her family barbecue, and I accepted without hesitation something that would have once triggered a cascade of guilt about divided loyalties. Standing in her backyard with a paper plate and a cold drink, listening to easy laughter that did not come with expectations, I felt a surprising swell of gratitude, not because it replaced my family, but because it showed me what connection could look like without control. The realization did not erase the sadness entirely, but it reframed it, turning it from a personal failure into a mismatch I had spent years trying to correct alone. Around that time, my therapist asked me what justice meant to me now after everything that had happened, and the question lingered long after the session ended. I thought about courtrooms and apologies and dramatic reckonings, the images people often associate with closure, and none of them fit what I had experienced. The justice I recognized was quieter, a series of outcomes that had unfolded not because I demanded them, but because I refused to subsidize behavior that harmed me. My parents had adjusted not gracefully, but inevitably learning to manage their own expenses and image without my involvement. My brother had learned, perhaps reluctantly, that independence was not optional. My uncle had learned that intimidation carried consequences beyond family circles. And I had learned that stepping back was not abandonment, it was alignment with reality. There were moments when doubt still surfaced, usually late at night, or around holidays, when old scripts whispered that I was being cold or unforgiving, but those thoughts no longer owned me. I had evidence now, not just documents and reports, but lived experience proof that my life functioned better when I was not constantly appeasing people who did not respect me. On a practical level, I kept my boundaries simple and consistent, responding only to direct, respectful communication and ending conversations that drifted into blame or manipulation, and over time, that consistency did what arguments never could. It set expectations. The dramatic gestures faded, the urgency dissipated. What remained was a manageable distance that protected my peace without requiring constant vigilance. One evening, as I was organizing files on my computer, I stumbled across the folder I had created during the height of the conflict, full of messages, screenshots, and reports, and instead of feeling triggered or angry, I felt something close to compassion for the version of myself who had needed that structure to feel sane. I did not delete the folder because it represented a boundary backed by reality, but I closed it without lingering, aware that it no longer defined my present. The most unexpected change was the way my sense of self had expanded beyond reaction, how decisions felt lighter when they were not framed as statements or defenses, but simply as choices. I chose where to spend my time, who to invite into my life, and how much access anyone had to me. And each choice reinforced the last, building a stability that did not depend on approval. As summer deepened, I hosted friends for dinner in my apartment, the same space that had once echoed with fear, and as we laughed and ate and stayed up too late talking about nothing important, I felt a grounded certainty settle in. This was what safety felt like, not the absence of conflict, but the presence of agency, and it was something I had earned not by winning an argument, but by refusing to disappear. As autumn returned and the year began to fold in on itself, I noticed how my memories of that Thanksgiving dinner no longer carried the same sharp edge, not because the hurt had vanished, but because it had finally been placed in context instead of being allowed to dominate the present. I could remember the table, the laughter, my mother telling me to be grateful I could sit there without my chest tightening or my mind racing to rewrite the scene, and that change felt like a quiet victory I had not known to name before. The distance I had maintained did not turn me into someone bitter or closed off. As I had once feared, it made me more precise with my energy, more intentional about who I trusted and why. I found myself investing in relationships that did not require me to prove my worth through usefulness. Friendships where care flowed both ways and disagreements did not threaten belonging, and that contrast sharpened my understanding of what had been missing for so long. Around that time, my parents reached out again with a short message suggesting a phone call to catch up, written in careful language that avoided responsibility while hinting at nostalgia. And I took a full day before responding, not because I was unsure, but because I was deciding how to honor myself. When I replied, I proposed a limited call with clear boundaries and the option to end it if voices were raised or blame surfaced, and to my surprise, they agreed, perhaps because the new rules were the only access available. The call itself was restrained and awkward, filled with small talk and careful pauses, my mother circling the past without naming it, and my father offering updates about work and health. And while it did not provide closure, it confirmed something important. I could participate without surrendering, listen without fixing, and end the call without apology when it began to drift toward old patterns. Afterward, I sat in my apartment and took inventory of my feelings, noticing relief rather than guilt, steadiness rather than anxiety, and I recognized that this was the measure I would use going forward. Any contact that cost me my peace was too expensive, regardless of blood. In therapy, we talked about grief again, not the acute kind that arrives with loss, but the slow grief of accepting limits, and I learned to sit with it without trying to resolve it into a neat lesson. Some things I was told are simply true and painful at the same time, and maturity lies in carrying both without distortion. I practiced that acceptance in small ways, declining invitations that felt performative, leaving conversations when my body signaled discomfort, and reminding myself that consistency was kinder than confrontation. The legal documentation remained untouched in its folder, not because it was forgotten, but because it had done its job creating a boundary that did not need to be revisited unless crossed. Knowing it existed allowed me to relax further into my life, to plan ahead, without contingency anxiety, to imagine futures that were not shaped by reaction. I began volunteering on weekends, something I had always postponed, and the act of giving by choice rather than obligation reframed generosity for me, making it feel expansive instead of draining. On one crisp evening, as I walked home with a bag of groceries and the city glowing softly around me, I realized that my definition of family had changed, not shrinking, but becoming more honest. It now included people who showed up without demands, who respected my no, who celebrated my independence instead of resenting it, and that shift did not require permission. When the holidays approached again, I made plans early and simply hosting a small dinner with friends who brought warmth rather than expectations, and the absence of tension was noticeable in the way laughter came easily, and the night unfolded without scripts. There was a moment while washing dishes afterward when I felt a flicker of sadness for what could have been, and I let it pass through me without judgment, understanding that honoring myself did not mean erasing longing. It meant refusing to let longing dictate my boundaries. By the time I turned off the lights and settled in for the night, I felt a grounded certainty that had nothing to do with winning or proving anything. The justice that had emerged was not a public reckoning or a perfect reconciliation. It was a durable peace, built through clarity, consistency, and the courage to stop disappearing. And as I lay there listening to the city breathe, I knew that whatever the future held, it would be shaped by choice rather than fear. The second holiday season after everything happened felt different in a way I could not have predicted, not quieter exactly, but lighter, as if the weight I had carried for years had finally been set down without ceremony. There were no dramatic confrontations, no surprise visits, no frantic messages demanding explanations, and that absence itself was proof that the boundaries I had built were holding. I noticed how naturally my life moved now, how decisions no longer required rehearsals or contingency plans, how my energy was no longer divided between living and managing other people's reactions. When my parents sent a short message wishing me a happy holiday, I replied with a simple thank you and nothing more, and the exchange ended there, clean and contained, without the familiar aftershock of guilt or dread. That restraint, once unimaginable to me, now felt almost ordinary, a sign that my nervous system had finally learned what safety looked like. I spent the holidays with friends who had become family in the truest sense. People who did not ask for explanations or loyalty tests, who understood that presence was a gift, not a debt. And as we cooked and talked and lingered at the table long after the meal was over, I felt a deep sense of belonging that did not require me to shrink or perform. There was laughter, real laughter that did not come at anyone's expense. And in those moments, I realized how warped my definition of love had once been, how easily I had confused endurance with devotion. The contrast was not painful the way it once would have been. It was instructive, quietly reinforcing the choices I had made. In therapy, I talked about forgiveness not as something owed or demanded, but as a process that could exist without reconciliation, and that distinction shifted something important inside me. I learned that forgiveness did not require access, explanation, or restored closeness. It required honesty and distance, and sometimes it unfolded simply as neutrality, the absence of constant emotional charge. That understanding allowed me to think about my family with less intensity, to see them as flawed people shaped by their own histories rather than villains or authorities without excusing the harm they had caused. On a practical level, my life continued to stabilize in ways that felt almost anticlimactic but deeply satisfying. A promotion at work that came without fanfare, savings that grew steadily. Now that my finances were not quietly subsidizing others' plans made months in advance without fear of disruption. I noticed how often I caught myself smiling for no reason, small moments of contentment arising in the middle of ordinary days, and each time it happened, it felt like evidence that the chaos I once believed was inevitable had never been inherent to me. Occasionally, someone would mention my family in passing, a relative asking if I planned to visit an acquaintance sharing a vague update, and instead of feeling pulled into explanation mode, I simply answered in general terms and changed the subject. My boundaries now internal as much as external. The folder of documentation remained untouched, not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer loomed as a threat or reminder. It was simply there, a record of a chapter that had closed. One evening, as I reorganized my apartment, I found the same handwritten card from my mother, again, tucked into a book I rarely opened, and this time, instead of lingering on it, I placed it gently back and closed the book. Understanding that memories did not need to be resolved to be integrated, they could exist without governing my present. The most striking change was how I related to myself, how my inner voice had softened, less accusatory, more curious, more protective, as if the boundary I had built with my family had extended inward, reshaping the way I treated my own doubts and needs. I no longer asked myself what I owed by default. I asked what felt sustainable, what aligned with the life I was building, and those questions guided me more reliably than guilt ever had. As the year drew to a close, I reflected on how far I had come from that dinner table where I had been told to be grateful just to sit there, and the irony did not escape me. I was grateful now not for inclusion on someone else's terms, but for the clarity that exclusion had forced upon me. Clarity that had led to self-respect, safety, and a life that felt genuinely my own. The justice in that realization was quiet but profound, rooted not in punishment or validation, but in the simple fact that I no longer needed permission to exist fully, and that knowledge had changed everything. When I look back now, the moment that changed everything is no longer the night my mother handed out gifts and skipped over me, or even the day my family showed up outside my door and security had to step in. It is the quieter realization that followed the understanding that I had spent most of my life confusing endurance with love and silence with maturity. That realization did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly as my life continued without the constant chaos I once believed was normal. As days passed where no one demanded explanations, no one tested my loyalty, and no one laughed at my expense and called it family humor. I began to see my story not as one of rejection, but of awakening, because being excluded at that table forced me to finally include myself in my own life. There was no dramatic apology waiting at the end of this journey, no tearful reconciliation that wrapped everything up neatly, and I no longer needed one because the absence of that fantasy was replaced by something far more durable, a sense of self-trust I had never fully developed before. I trusted my instincts now, the tightening in my chest when something felt wrong, the calm clarity that followed firm boundaries, the relief that came when I chose consistency over explanation, and that trust guided me more reliably than any external approval ever had. My family and I exist now in a careful, limited distance, polite but contained, and while part of me once feared that outcome, I understand now that distance can be an act of care, not punishment, especially when closeness has only ever existed on unequal terms. I no longer measure success by how much I can give without complaint or how well I can smooth over discomfort for others. I measure it by how safe I feel in my own body and how honestly I can live without fear of retaliation. The justice in my story is not loud or triumphant. It does not involve anyone being publicly shamed or dramatically transformed. It is simply the fact that the systems meant to protect me worked when I finally allowed them to, and that my refusal to disappear forced accountability where words never could. I learned that boundaries are not ultimatums, they are descriptions of reality, and once stated and enforced, they reshape the landscape of a relationship whether the other person agrees or not. If there is a lesson I carry forward, it is this. Love that requires you to shrink is not love, and loyalty that demands silence is not loyalty. It is control wearing a familiar face. I still feel sadness sometimes, especially around holidays or milestones, but it no longer convinces me that I did something wrong. It simply reminds me that choosing yourself often means grieving what you hoped for, and that grief is a reasonable price for peace. My life now is not perfect, but it is steady, and steadiness was something I never had when I was constantly bracing for the next demand or the next joke at my expense. I wake up in my own space, make decisions without rehearsing defenses, and invest my time in people who show up without conditions, and that ordinariness feels extraordinary compared to the chaos I left behind. If someone listening to this recognizes themselves in my story, if they have ever been told to be grateful just to be included or pressured to carry the weight of other people's comfort at the expense of their own, I hope they know this. Stepping back is not cruelty. It is clarity, and choosing your safety is not betrayal. It is self-respect. You do not need permission to draw a line, and you do not need consensus to keep it. Sometimes the most powerful ending is not a confrontation, but a quiet life built on your own terms, where you are no longer grateful just to be allowed in the room because you finally understand that the room belongs to you.